In this lesson, we will focus on evaluating your impact. If you remember from the last lesson, we mentioned that this is one of the ways to ensure impact. Let's start by understanding why evaluation is so important. Evaluation isn't just a final step, it's an ongoing part of the creative process. When we create art for social impact, we aim not only to express ourselves, but to influence how others think, feel, and act. If we don't evaluate, we're left guessing whether our work actually makes the impact we hope for. Evaluation helps us answer questions like, did my work effectively communicate the message I intended? Did it evoke the right emotional responses in my audience? Did it lead to any tangible change, like action or new conversations? By reflecting on these questions, you can refine your approach and better understand how to improve future projects. A key point is that evaluation shouldn't only happen at the end of a project. It should be integrated into your process from the very beginning. We'll go through a breakdown of 3 stages of evaluation: pre-evaluation, mid-evaluation, and post-evaluation. Before you even begin creating, it is important to critically about your goals. What do you want to achieve with your piece? Who are you trying to reach, and how do you want them to respond? Setting clear objectives at this stage gives you benchmarks to evaluate against later. For example, if you're working on a campaign to raise awareness about gender-based violence, pre-evaluation might involve figuring out what kind of change you want to see, such as people signing petitions, engaging in discussions, or them attending peaceful protests. Mid-evaluation. This is one of the most important stages, but it's often overlooked, which I guess is because it happens while you are still working on your piece, allowing you to make adjustments before it's entirely finalized. But how do you evaluate your work in progress effectively? Let's break this down. First, when should you evaluate mid-process? At key milestones. For example, after completing your first draft, or once you've finished an important section of the project. This doesn't need to be an exhaustive process, but checking in at these moments can prevent larger issues from creeping into the final work. Who should you ask for feedback? You should ask trusted peers, mentors, and even small segments of your target audience. For example, if your piece is designed for young people, gather a small group of them to test it out. These individuals should represent the audience you want to reach. In some cases, it's also helpful to ask people outside of your usual circle to gain a fresh perspective. As you probably know, there are different modes that you can consider using when asking for feedback. One is informal conversations, which involves a casual approach that can encourage honest responses. There are also anonymous surveys, which can be quick forms with open-ended questions. Another one is interviews, which is a more structured interview with a few key individuals can yield deep insights. There are many others, for instance, observations. The goal is just to find a way to get real insights. But then how do you ask for feedback? We encourage you to ensure that you create a safe space for feedback where people feel comfortable being honest. Emphasize that their input is valuable and won't hurt your feelings. Also, ask open-ended questions. Avoid leading questions that force a particular response. Instead, ask questions like, what's your initial reaction to this work? What feelings does this evoke? Is anything unclear or confusing? Does this align with your experience or what you know about the issue? Next, observe body language and behavior. If your work is interactive or visual, observe how people physically engage with it. Do they stop and look? Do they move closer or further away? Body language can tell you a lot about engagement levels. Another very important one is to give people time. Sometimes feedback requires reflection. Encourage people to take their time with your work and provide feedback afterward if necessary. This is especially important for complex or emotional subjects that require time to capture the depth of their experience. This will give you richer, more actionable feedback. One other tip we have for you is that you should not overcommit to one idea too early. Mid-evaluation is your chance to make changes, so stay flexible and be willing to pivot if the feedback suggests your approach isn't landing well. Next, we have the post-evaluation, which is done after your work is complete and has been released to the world. Here you can assess the full impact of your piece. Post-evaluation is essential for understanding whether the work had the social impact you were aiming for. But when should you evaluate after the work is complete? Post-evaluation doesn't need to happen immediately after the project's release. Sometimes, giving your audience time to process and reflect before seeking feedback yields more thoughtful responses. A good rule of thumb is to wait a week or two before conducting any formal evaluations, especially if your work is part of a campaign that people might need time to interact with. Okay, we've covered the when, but now, who should you ask? It's important to go beyond your immediate circle. Reach out to your primary audience, the people who were directly targeted by your project. But don't forget to also ask your secondary audience too. But what questions should you ask? Again, similar to what we talked about for the mid-evaluation, you should start by asking open-ended questions that encourage people to share their personal experiences and reactions. Avoid asking questions that lead to specific answers. For example, instead of asking, "Did you like it?" which can yield superficial responses, ask, "What stood out to you the most?" Or, "How did the artwork make you feel about this issue?" You can ask more questions like, "What was your immediate reaction to the piece? Did it prompt any new thoughts or reflections on the issue? What would you say to others about the work?" Similar to what we discussed for mid-evaluation, the modes of feedback, depending on your project, can be through online surveys, interviews, or even observation. For public art, you might spend time near the installation, observing how people interact with it. In more formal settings, like a school, store, or workshop, you can distribute feedback forms or hold short discussions. Social media is another useful tool, especially for evaluating how your work resonates with a broader audience. Track comments, shares, and hashtags associated with your project to see how far the message is spreading. Once you've gathered feedback, analyze it carefully. Look for common themes in people's responses. Were there certain aspects of the work that everyone seemed to engage with? Did some parts fall flat? Compare these insights to your original goals to see whether your work achieved its intended purpose. Just to remind you, all of the things in this lesson are simply strong recommendations from us. You need to think and figure out what works best for you, your work, and your process. Just make sure to be honest with yourself. Now, for some additional tips that we have for you. Be open to criticism. It's easy to become attached to your work, but evaluation requires you to be open to criticism. Even negative feedback can be constructive and help you improve future projects. Remember, evaluation isn't about affirming your brilliance, but about finding ways to strengthen your impact. 2. Use a variety of methods. No single evaluation method works for every project. Try different approaches: written surveys, focus groups, one-on-one interviews, or observational studies. The more diverse your evaluation methods, the more nuanced your insights will be. 3. Ask follow-up questions. Don't just take initial feedback at face value. Often, the most valuable insights come from asking follow-up questions. If someone says, "I thought it was great," you might follow up with, "What specifically stood out to you?" Or, "Did the piece prompt you to think differently about the issue?" Next, focus on outcomes, not just feelings. It's great if people enjoyed your work, but when you're creating art for social impact, you need to focus on whether your work prompted action. Ask questions that move beyond how people felt and get to whether they were motivated to do something. Next, learn from the unintended audience. Sometimes your work reaches people you didn't expect. Instead of dismissing them, include these unintended audiences in your evaluation. You might discover new insights or unexpected positive effects. However, always keep in mind that not all unintended audiences will respond positively. It's important to stay focused on your main goals and not get derailed by every outlying opinion. Next, consider long-term impact. Social change doesn't always happen immediately. If your project aims for a deep systemic change, consider evaluating its impact over a longer period of time. Did the work create any lasting changes in attitudes or behaviors? Another one is to consider ethical considerations in evaluation. Evaluating ethically is crucial, especially when you're working on sensitive social issues. Make sure you're gathering feedback in a respectful way that doesn't exploit or misrepresent the people you're trying to help. Final one is to reflect on your work. Always take time to listen to your own thoughts about your own work. Once you know your aim, you can easily gauge whether your piece is working by asking yourself a few simple questions. What did I hope would happen? What actually happened? What worked as expected? What didn't go as planned? What surprised me along the way? Most importantly, knowing what I know now, what could I do differently? Your project might exceed your expectations or fall short. Either way, the insights you gain will help shape your future work. The key is to keep learning and adjusting.